Hi everyone, I'm Freya Mathews and I'm looking forward to meeting you all and working with you. I'm really excited about the idea of participating in an inquiry as opposed to a course, especially an inquiry which we're hoping will include some collaborators beyond our own little human circle. I'm kind of dreaming of this inquiry as a conference of rivers or waterways, in which we become channels or canals for communication across the world, which enable these rivers or waterways to confer together. So I'm coming to the inquiry as a philosopher, and today I just want to set out some philosophical ideas that might help to provide a frame for our inquiry. And those ideas are particularly panpsychism and some associated notions associated with panpsychism. And so that I can be as concise as possible in this talk, I will be reading it, so there won't actually be that much to see. So if you feel like just settling back and closing your eyes and listening, or going and doing the dishes and listening while you're doing the dishes, that'd be fine. So what is panpsychism? In the broadest of terms, it's the view that mind, in the sense of mental properties such as subjectivity, agency, will, sentience, maybe consciousness, self-meaning, self-value, all these properties are different kinds of mental properties. But the idea is that mental properties of some kind are intrinsic to matter per se. That's to say, mind doesn't merely evolve out of matter. It's already immanent in matter from the start at the most fundamental level. To adopt this view, which is an ancient view in the West and in many other cultures, though it's decidedly not a modern view, is to see the world and everything in it as inherently alive. It's a world in which, as my colleague Deborah Rose used to say, nothing is nothing. Everything is considerable in its own right. This immediately raises the question of how we might live in such a world. And that's why panpsychism provides, I think, a fruitful framework for a framing metaphysic for our Living Waters inquiry. So panpsychism is enjoying a bit of a vogue at the moment, but that's happening mainly within the philosophy of consciousness. Most of the people who are currently keen on panpsychism are interested in it as a solution to the very difficult problem of how mind could have emerged in a world of mere matter, a world fully describable by physics. Panpsychists solve that problem by saying that mind never did emerge in this world because it was there all the time. Mentality, as I said, is a fundamental and irreducible aspect of matter itself. But for me, panpsychism arose not from philosophy of consciousness, but from environmental philosophy. And this makes a big difference to the use to which I want to put panpsychism. So I'll kick off my talk by backtracking a bit into environmental philosophy and explaining its relation to panpsychism. The first stirrings of environmental philosophy as an academic discipline occurred in the 1970s. In the decades since then, a huge amount of work has been done by philosophers, both to identify the philosophical origins of our environmental crisis and to formulate new, more bio-inclusive ethical foundations for thinking about the natural world. For most environmental philosophers, anthropocentrism has been and remains the deepest driver of environmental exploitation. From an anthropocentric perspective, moral considerability attaches only to humans and not to other forms of life. In the Western tradition, it's rooted in a form of dualism that goes all the way back to ancient Greece. Dualism sets up a categorical divide between mind and matter. Although complex material configurations may give rise to mental states, matter is seen from the dualist perspective as fundamentally and inherently mindless, insentient, and blind. As such, it does not matter to itself. It has no meaning or purpose of its own. It exists as something to be acted upon rather than as something that acts. Mind exists, in other words, only as small islands of sentience and hence of meaning and purpose in a vast cosmic sea of meaningless matter. So that's the dualist view of matter. Historically, under the influence of both Greek thought and Christianity, mind was generally viewed in the Western tradition as exclusively the province of humans. Only humans were regarded as possessing the kind of consciousness that meant they mattered to themselves. Humans were accordingly treated as the yardstick of all meaning, and in particular of moral significance. They mattered, morally speaking, because they had ends of their own and could not be treated as inert stuff fit only to be acted upon. Such an anthropocentric outlook was the corollary of mind-matter dualism and gave rise in turn to a purely instrumental attitude towards the earth and all its communities of life. This dualist view of matter as the intrinsically brute and blind, and of mind as the exclusive province of humans, reached its apotheosis in the Newtonian Cartesian science of the 17th century. It became the philosophical premise of the great historical project of human imperialism, otherwise known today as development, that has progressively converted the living complexity of Earth systems into the dead but ever-expanding monotony of industrialism. From the very beginning, going back to the 1970s, environmental philosophers, as I said, challenged anthropocentrism. They insisted that mind, and with it self-meaning, self-value, and hence moral considerability, was much more widely distributed on Earth than the anthropocentric attitude allowed. Some of these philosophers attributed mind, and hence moral considerability, to animals. I'm thinking here of Peter Singer in the 1970s and Tom Regan in the 1980s. And this position has recently been resoundingly validated by the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness that came out in 2012, and in which a large number of neurological scientists declared that many animals possess the same kind of consciousness and conscious life as basically as humans. In the last few years, some philosophers and even some scientists have also been attributing mind, or at any rate mind-like properties, to plants and perhaps to fungi. Both these positions, that affirming mind in animals and that affirming mind in plants, place significant moral limitations on instrumentalism. Other species can no longer be used simply as humans see fit from this point of view. Neither position, however, really calls into question the underlying assumption of dualism. Both accept that mind is based on the neurological or neuroequivalent structures we find in humans, and both these positions merely insist that such structures may reside in certain non-human as well as human organisms. The inherent deadness of matter is not thereby challenged. Mind still exists merely as a scatter of tiny islands of self-transparency in a sea of opaque deadness, a dualist universe. The attribution of mind to non-human organisms is arguably, in this sense, just an extension of anthropocentrism. This is a case of moral extensionism rather than a real departure from anthropocentrism. More radical approaches to the deconstruction of dualism have opened the category of mind up to larger than neurological interpretations. These include the relational approach. Mind can be seen as a distributive property of ecological systems. The blue whale, for example, may have the kind of neurological structures associated with high levels of consciousness, but those structures evolved, like its baleen system, as a function of its dependence on the humble krill. In that sense, whale intelligence is a distributed characteristic not merely of whales, but of the wider blue whale krill ecosystem. Such a relational point of view, according to which ecosystems as a whole may be seen as imbued with mind or mind-like properties, may seem to afford an adequate foundation for environmental ethics. In the final analysis, however, such relationalism really only partially dismantles dualism, although we may, under its direction, comport ourselves respectfully to all forms of biosis or biological life. Our default modality will remain the instrumental one, wherever our actions do not impinge on living systems, we can continue to blast a path through reality in a habitual manner. A more radical alternative to dualism is panpsychism. Mind, in the sense of some kind of interior dimension, is simply intrinsic to all of matter, as I said at the start. In light of this, even our most basic modality would have to be reformed and revised. All reality is now considered a terrain of self-transparency, self-reference, and sentience, to be negotiated with consideration and a light step. Panpsychism may take the analytical form currently popular in philosophy of consciousness that attributes mind in some attenuated sense even to the most fundamental constituents of matter. Or it might alternatively take a cosmological form, according to which the universe in itself as a whole is the ultimate locus of mind and hence of self-meaning and self-existence. It may seem doubtful whether analytical panpsychism, with the rudimentary forms of mentality it ascribes to the elementary constituents of matter, can add much in the way of moral significance to the natural environment beyond the significance that may already be agreed to inhere in biological systems. For this reason, I've argued in my work for the more encompassing moral orientation afforded by a version of cosmological panpsychism that I call living cosmos panpsychism. From the perspective of living cosmos panpsychism, the universe is a self-creating, self-maintaining, in a word, self-realizing system. Its manifest aspect, as described by physics, is the outward appearance of an inner field of subjectivity or awareness. This field, manifested outwardly as spatiality, is differentiated into modes that appear outwardly as physical particulars and inwardly as disturbances in the inner field of awareness. Reality is understood, in other words, as both a unity and as a manifold of differentia, a one and a many. Viewed from within, it's a field of subjectivity with a connotivity, by which I mean a will to realize itself and increase its own existence, so a connotivity of its own and a capacity for communication. From the viewpoint of its own finite modes, or those of them that are capable of acting as observers, it's an order of extension as represented by physics. The kinds of modes capable of acting as observers are, like the living cosmos itself, self-realizing systems, though only relatively so, and unlike the living cosmos, they seek to realize themselves on a finite scale. Generally speaking, finite self-realizing systems, which I term selves, equate with living systems, organisms, and possibly higher order living systems such as ecosystems or Gaia as a whole. Such finite selves are imbued, again relatively speaking, with a connotivity of their own, a will to persevere in and increase their own existence. There are two distinctive features of the living cosmos. We can talk about that, the philosophical details of that living cosmos view, that cosmological version of panpsychism, if you're interested in following that up in the course of our inquiry. There are two distinctive features of the living cosmos that I'd like to emphasize here, and I'd like to emphasize this regardless of whether or not you choose to follow up the philosophical arguments that lead to a cosmological version of panpsychism. The first such feature is communicativity, and the second is normativity. And I'll discuss each of these in turn. So the idea is that the living cosmos is a communicative cosmos, and that it is normative in its fundamental nature. It has a kind of ought at its core. I'll explain in a minute. So firstly, communicativity. As a locus of connotivity in its own right, the living cosmos is capable of and actively seeks communicative engagement with its finite modes, the selves, or again, with those of them that are capable of such engagement. There are selves that wouldn't be capable of such engagement, simpler living systems that are non-reflexive and not really interested in the possibility of such engagement. Wherever this communicative engagement is actualized, it's manifested in a poetic order, an order of poetic revelation that unfolds alongside the causal order. The poetic order, or order of meaning, exceeds the causal order, but in no way contradicts it. What do I mean by this? Let's just drill down into this idea a little more. Connotivity, as I've mentioned, is the will of a being to persevere in and increase its own existence. For systems intrinsically structured, as all conative systems are, via self-meaning as well as via physical causation, communication represents a further horizon for self-realization and self-increase. It's through communication with other selves, each possessed of their own distinctive viewpoint, that any given self can deepen and expand the reach of its own subjectivity. For the living cosmos itself, as a conative system, the only others available for such communicative exchange are the finite selves that has itself constituted through its processes of self-differentiation. From the present point of view, then, the universe is capable of and actively seeks communicative engagement with its own finite modes as a way of increasing its own self-meaning and hence self-existence. As I said, wherever this communicative engagement is actualized, we might speak of a poetic order, an order of poetic revelation unfolding alongside the causal order. By poetic order, I mean an order of meaningful configurations of circumstances that constellate as a result of intentional invocation on our part. We invoke the world in certain selected terms, and the world may respond by arranging itself to match those terms. The terms in question will be unavoidably poetic in the sense of metaphorical, since the only language available to the world is a language of things. That's to say, while the world can't literally speak to us in words, it can arrange concrete particulars in meaningful configurations, in the same way that poetry and dreams use imagery to create and convey meaning. Instances of such poetic engagement between self and world we might describe as instances of ontopoetics. So what are some examples of ontopoetics? The world's religions and folk traditions provide a treasury of instances of ontopoetics. The Old Testament is overflowing with them, from the burning bush encountered by Moses to the Israelites' pillar of fire by night and of cloud by day, to the rainbow that appeared to Noah when the great flood subsided. Such signs may be seen as ontopoetic responses to the Judaic narratives that framed particular acts or states of invocation amongst the ancient Jewish people. Rainbows do in fact seem to be a favorite ontopoetic trope, from the rainbow bodies of enlightened lamas in Tibet, to rainbow serpent manifestations in Indigenous Australia, to more humble rainbow moments in our own personal lives, moments when a rainbow might appear synchronistically at a significant juncture, seeming to offer a token of hope or of blessing or of affirmation from the depths of the world. For indeed, the ontopoetic lexicon that frames a given act or state of invocation need not be drawn only from the narratives of established religions or folk traditions. Individuals may discover in the course of a lifetime a story or numinous image that seems to answer to their own particular truth, a story or image that can serve for them as a guiding symbol or myth. It might offer itself from some ancient source, or it might arrive freshly minted by way of, say, a big dream, a dream experienced by the individual himself or herself. He or she might then adopt this story or symbol as a poetic frame for an intentional act of invocation, where such an act might take various forms, including, for example, that of a journey or a pilgrimage. Journeys or pilgrimages also seem to have particular ontopoetic force, but larger gatherings with ritual intent in landscape can be efficacious too, as can smaller private rituals. Of course, no ontopoetic outcome is ever assured in these situations, and I'm a little bit cautious about undertaking invocational activities merely for the purpose of inducing such a response. These activities may be undertaken for their own sake as voyages of discovery and expressions of devotion in their own right, rather than merely as exercises designed to evoke an ontopoetic response. It may be wise to keep one's gaze slightly averted in this connection, slightly blurred. No one, after all, likes a suitor who expects or presumes, but a suitor must make an overture, must try to address the prospective beloved in a language they can share, And it does seem, as South American ethnologist extraordinaire Viveros de Castro notes, that no matter how alienated from any sense of the sacredness of landscape people may have become, as soon as they start re-engaging it in ceremonial forms of exchange, it does respond, or at least it sometimes responds. Beings turn up at their ceremonies, or the cosmos offers other signs of its attention. So that was the first feature of the living cosmos that I thought might be relevant to our inquiry. The second feature is its normativity, meaning that as a locus of connotivity, the living cosmos aims at something. It strives for something, namely its own existence. It actively structures itself in ways that enable it to perpetuate and increase its own existence. As part of its fabric, the finite modes or selves must also contribute in their own small ways to that larger end. The purpose of their existence within this larger scheme must also ultimately be to contribute to the overall cohering and regenerativity of the cosmos. So there is, in this sense, an ought at the core of the living cosmos, of which we as finite selves need to be mindful. But how do we know how to serve the cosmic ought? How do we know how we can live our lives in a way that will contribute to the overall cohering and regenerativity of the living cosmos? Well, I think a quick look at the way life sustains and regenerates itself here on Earth does give us a clue. There are certain principles at work in ecosystems that spontaneously assure the ongoing adaptivity and flourishing of those systems. These principles have long been self-evident to many indigenous peoples. We might describe them as, firstly, our old friend, the principle of connotivity, and secondly, a principle of accommodation and least resistance. And together, these principles might be encapsulated in the concept of synergy. I've already explained what I mean by connotivity. It's the impulse that drives all living things to preserve and increase their own existence. But in the living world, this drive is qualified by a principle of least resistance. Organisms which conserve their energy by adapting their ends as far as possible to the ends of the organisms surrounding them will be naturally selected over organisms which needlessly provoke resistance and competition from others. In other words, by accommodating others, desiring what simultaneously serves the needs of those others, rather than pitting oneself against them, one avoids squandering one's own energy unnecessarily, where this advantages one in the struggle to preserve and increase one's own existence. In the biosphere, the behavior of most species broadly follows the principle of accommodation and least resistance, because this is the strategy that, being energy conserving, logically results from natural selection. Conflict, competition, and predation do, of course, also occur in nature, where the interests of particular species or individuals cannot achieve synergy with those of others. Conflict will result. But such conflict will always entail an energy cost for the species or individuals in question, and modes of conflict themselves will in turn be shaped by the principle of least resistance, by analogy with martial arts, in which the practitioner learns to conserve his own energy while turning the force used by opponents back against them. At the end of the day, the imperative to accommodate others, in the sense of adapting one's own desires to others' needs, will be what ensures that every living thing, in seeking its own self-existence, at the same time perpetuates the larger system. My favourite example of this logic of synergy here in Australia is the little truffle-eating, truffle-loving bettong, a tiny macropod or mini kangaroo that acts as an ecological engineer in its environment. In the process of digging for truffles, bettongs aerate and irrigate woodland soils and improve conditions for seed germination, thereby helping to assure the future of the woodlands on which bettongs themselves depend for their truffles. In this sense, the principle of accommodating others by adapting one's own desires to their ends assures the ongoing regenerativity of life. This logic of synergy has been recognized in Indigenous societies, particularly here in Aboriginal Australia, and variously articulated across a wide variety of cultural frames as law. Law, in boldface with a capital L. In the course of history, however, agrarian societies were enabled to depart from law by substituting external sources of power, such as domesticated animals or slaves, or more recently fossil fuels, for the energy available to people from their own bodies. This has enabled us as humans, unlike other species who seek to pit themselves against others but suffer exhaustion and selective disadvantage as a result, it's enabled us to impose ourselves on our environment with impunity. Moreover, through our highly developed reflexivity, our capacity to reflect on and hence change our behavior, we can also substitute arbitrary, culturally mediated ends for the ends imprinted in us through evolution. So, for example, instead of desiring sweet fruits that we may have been naturally selected to crave because in consuming them we dispersed their seeds, we may now desire, say, sugary confections, where consuming these in no way serves the interests of other species. We have indeed stopped desiring what earth others need us to desire, and in the recent past we seem to have gotten away with this as a species. But now we're starting to pay the price for abandoning this fundamental logic of synergy, as the larger life system, no longer replenished by our input, is unraveling before our eyes. But it will always remain open to us through the same capacity for reflexivity that enabled us to depart from synergy in the first place, to review and revise our desires so as to align them anew with what our earthkin need us to want. And when we're given revelatory glimpses of our place in the poetic fabric of a living cosmos through ontopoetic moments in which it's as if that cosmos speaks to us by our very name, then not only the threat of biosphere collapse, but our own hearts may pull us back into law. So much more to talk about here, and hopefully we will continue this discussion in the course of the inquiry. But that's it for today. Time for me to take my walk, my daily walk down to my local creek. And thanks for your attention, and looking forward to meeting you soon.